Hello, and welcome to the podcast. I read this headline in Monday's Times. Badenoch, BBC Arabic, platforms hate and terror. The Conservative leader had sent a letter to the BBC Director General, which, the Times said, threatened her party's withdrawal of support for the licence fee if there is not wholesale reform. Badenoch wrote, "A public service broadcaster appears to become a platform for race hate, extremism, and the endorsement of terror." As we record this podcast, the BBC has not replied in detail. The Conservative leader based her remarks on a report from what the Times called the media watchdog, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, CAMRA for short. What the Times did not point out is that CAMRA is an American pro-Israeli media monitoring group. Its critics claim that it is an extreme Israeli advocacy group, which is not to say that its report is wrong or invalid, but that readers should be made aware of its background. This, of course, is part of the propaganda war going on over Gaza. Previously on the podcast, I've interviewed the British-Israeli lawyer Trevor Assison, who severely criticised BBC coverage of Gaza, and his criticism sparked headlines in the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail. This week, we thought it might be useful to have a different perspective on the propaganda war. Yasmin Alibhai-Brown describes herself as a lefty liberal, anti-racist, feminist Muslim. Writing recently, she wrote, "I despair at the decision of the BBC to remove Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone from the BBC." On Wednesday morning this week, I asked her why.
Well, I don't think that's what the BBC should have done, because it's very rare, and we can talk about that as we go along, for Palestinians, and let me just say three things, because I know you have to say it, because there's willful misunderstanding of who you are and what you think. I have always supported the right of Israel to exist, even from the time I was a little girl. And the second point is that this is not a religious cause for me. The cause of Palestinian rights is a secular cause. And some of its most important voices were Christians like Edward Said and Hanan al-Ashrawi. This is very important to me. And thirdly, every time I talk about this on the media, this kind of voice comes at me. Do you condemn Hamas? It's as if that's your passport to speaking. So I do not condone what Hamas did on October the 7th, all those months ago. So we can clear that up. I'm not an apologist for Hamas or anything.
That's very clear. You've written, I know, that Muslims and others should stop focusing solely on the wrongdoing of Israel. It is no longer morally justifiable for activists to target only Israel and either ignore or find excuses for corrupt, murderous Arab despots. Now, you've made that extremely clear. But you are very worried, you are appalled, and you're talking about censorship. Now, there's a difference, surely, between the Director General of the BBC looking at this documentary and saying, actually it's misleading to the audience because we haven't properly given information about the nature of the narrator and the narrator's relationship with his father, who works in some form for the government, the Hamas government, that therefore I'll take it off until I'm absolutely certain we can trust it. But as I understand it, they are prepared, in principle, to put it in an edited form back on the network.
Well, I didn't know that, and I'm not sure that will happen, because the pressure on the BBC at the moment, and I'm a total advocate of public service broadcasting, and the BBC is in my blood. I grew up in Africa. Everything we knew came through the BBC, but I'm not sure this is going to happen. And I do think it's censorship. We were constantly being told that this is a free society and there are all these woke people and others who are trying to stop us speaking. And yet when it comes to this issue and some others, I'm doing a whole session at the Oxford Literary Festival in a couple of weeks on this, censorship and freedom. This to me is censorship because they have removed the possibility of people being able to watch. Now,
well, hold on a second.
There was a letter.
Hold on. No, I must say, the BBC's position is officially, and I think the chairman has also repeated this, that they have not ruled out transmitting an edited form of the documentary. So let's just note that again. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. But in principle, they've allowed it. Yeah.
Well, I hope it does. And if it does, I'll take away my words. Okay, even in my column, say I thought they wouldn't do this, but at the moment I wrote that column, this had happened, and there was a very interesting letter to the Guardian by Peter Grimsdale, who was a former commissioning editor at the BBC and also Channel 4 at one point. And he also thinks, like I do, that the programme should be put back on BBC iPlayer with appropriate changes, and I think a really long statement at the beginning saying what happened.
I think that may well happen. Of course, one of the fundamental problems here for journalists and for the BBC is that independent journalists are not allowed into Gaza.
Yes.
So, and no one appreciates that there are particular difficulties, but in other wars, clearly accredited correspondents have gone in with the armed forces. There is supposed to be anyway now a ceasefire. Still, independent journalists are not allowed in there. So there's that problem. The other problem is that if you live in Gaza at the moment, Hamas controls nearly everything. So it's almost impossible to do anything without at least Hamas being aware of it and tolerating it. So you're caught as a journalist on the outside by these two things: the inability to go in and verify things yourself, the knowledge that people can only speak virtually with one, looking over their shoulder as they have to do in other totalitarian regimes because Hamas might be over there. It's a fiendish thing to negotiate, isn't it?
Well, yes, but the greater censorship is being imposed by Israel. Over 140 journalists have been killed. And, I was at the RTS Awards because I'm a judge, and I was absolutely gratified that fact was mentioned, because you can look at our media and there's nothing about it. And the independent journalism thing is a very important point, because no journalists have been allowed in. And I think Israel, and I've got this figure somewhere, figure about how when it comes to journalistic freedom now, Reporters Without Borders place Israel at number 101 out of 180 states in press freedom ranking. Okay, and I know Israeli journalists. I get some of my most important news from Haaretz. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it.
Yes, it does, and it's I suppose you could say it's a left-leaning newspaper. But what strikes me about that, because I also get lots of information from it, is that it's remarkably critical of the Netanyahu government. It asks all the difficult questions, but you don't get the equivalent of that in the United Kingdom. It's a paradox, isn't it, that within Israel itself, that's a tribute to the Israel that was set up, and how long will continue, another matter, but Haaretz is able to do this. But somehow, outside of Israel, that argument is not possible. And I think part of the function, or part of the reason for this, is the understandable attitude of Jews in this country, which is still that however critical they might be, and many are, of Israel and Netanyahu, such is the wave of anti-Semitism around the world, such is the need to ensure Israel exists, that a lot of people are silent. They're silently critical, but they're silent.
Well, a lot of Jewish people in Britain aren't. Many. I've been on the marches, and there are so many Jewish people, quite well-known Jewish people, ordinary Jewish people, Jewish friends of mine, who are on that march, saying not in my name. But I also think it's important to remember that what Haaretz has been able to do, which is extremely important, is remind people that Hamas was created by Netanyahu. And this was affirmed last week in an internal report by one of the Israeli security services. I don't know if you saw it. It was reported in The Guardian. And they said, that they blamed themselves for knowing something was afoot with Hamas and not attending to it as they should have done. It's a very honest report. And secondly, that Netanyahu allowed the Hamas to grow because the original struggle, as I said at the beginning, the Palestinian struggle was a secular struggle. And the idea was to divide them and kind of religiousize the movement, which they have succeeded in doing.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between that and creating. He obviously did not create Hamas, but I think there's a lot of evidence, a lot of people believe, that he encouraged Hamas because he ultimately is opposed to a Palestinian state. And he thought a better way forward is to have Hamas, as he thought, controllable, but so by its founding documents opposed to the existence of the Israeli state, that he could use that. I just want to ask about this. We've talked about the reticence. I think there is still some reticence among some Jews in the UK of saying anything very critical about Israel. And I think, the trauma of the Holocaust and everything else explains a lot of that. What I'm slightly baffled by is why a great deal of Palestinians in this country and Muslims don't seem to be as effective as supporters of Israel in getting their case across or making it. Now, we can talk in a minute about the organizations behind that, but when you talk to people who are sympathetic to the Palestinians, is it that they feel that the mainstream media is so rigged against them there's no point? Or what is it? Do you agree with my assessment that they're not as successful as getting their case across?
No, I don't agree. I think there's an effective closing off of those voices. And this is why this program was so important, because at least we saw what children, through the eyes of children. It's incredibly difficult here. Whenever I've been on and I've argued the case, I have no skin in this game, okay? I just think it's like South Africa for me, a human rights issue. But it is remarkably difficult, because if you say you support a Palestinian state, you get a very aggressive response. And don't listen to me. Just watch every interview with that, with the ambassador, the Palestinian ambassador, the Dr. Hussam Zamlot. Just watch 1, 2, 3 interviews with him. He's a deeply civilized man. He's not, wanting to destroy Israel. None of that. Many people in his family have been killed in this latest war. But every time he opens his mouth, he's treated with such disrespect, sometimes so bullied over Hamas, as if he's personally responsible for Hamas. Now, I don't think this is right or fair. I don't think one should be bullied for speaking up. And, here is this is a point I want to stress almost more than any other. This is an issue globally where most of the populations are pro-Palestinian, having watched what's going on, and the leaders are not. And we had this split over the Iraq war. Here, like I said, it's unsustainable. Proper journalism would allow these voices space and time to speak about why this is happening, how it's affecting them. But I'm sorry to say this, but people like Danny Cohen and Michael Grade, especially at previously of the BBC, have become quite ruthless in their support of...
Well, hold on a second. I think we need to make a distinction here.
No, this is my view. I'm saying it's my view.
No, it's your view, yeah, but I think one ought to make a distinction between Michael Grade, who is supportive of Israel, but is also chair of Ofcom, and whose, I think, comments, as far as I can see, are relatively restrained, and those of Danny Cohen, a former director of television of the BBC, who is regularly writes in the Daily Telegraph, accusing the organisation of which he was a member of being anti-Semitic. And then you have other people like Melanie Phillips, who called the BBC the Mass Broadcasting Corporation. And the suggestion time and again is that the BBC is institutionally anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic.
Yeah, but I disagree with you about Michael Grade. I really do disagree with you about Michael Grade, because Michael Grade and Danny Cohen, I remember Ola Guerin, who's one of the most serious, intensely committed to truth journalists in the world, okay? So I remember this so well, that in 2020, the Jewish Board of Deputies accused her of unjustifiably offensive statement she made about standing in actually the Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, and she was saying, remembering the liberation of Auschwitz, and she mentioned the Palestinian territories in a very sensitive way. No way was she saying this is justifiable or anything. Cohen and Grade went for her. This is on record, you can look it up. And then in 2015, Michael Grade again accused her of siding with the Palestinians. So I'm sorry, there is a lot of, as chair of Ofcom, he is, of course, got the gravitas and he has to do the job. But also remember, he's also said now, in the last few days, that he's, if he's not satisfied with what the BBC does next, and also Channel 4, which also did the same stupid thing, about using that boy.
Yes, they used that boy without identifying his relationship.
Yeah, that Ofcom would take action. So I don't agree with you about. I think there are these forces, I think, that will not allow the BBC, or the BBC has decided it can't, fairly represent the Palestinian case.
Well, we will. I'm sure the BBC would deny it, and also we'll see whether this documentary is shown again in some form. And I'm sure Michael Grade would argue that he's both capable of identifying with his community, but also being independent. But I think the larger question, or the question we can say, is that but of course, if you say this, you are accused of being anti-Semitic, is that the pro-Israeli groupings, lobby or whatever, are far more effective in the British media than are those who are sympathetic and supportive of Palestinians. That's undoubtedly the case with Daily Telegraph, it's undoubtedly the case with GB News and so on. The other thing which strikes me, however, is also that the journalists as a whole in newspapers ought to be more honest about identifying the sources and funding of some organisations that produce critical reports in this area. I mean, I was very struck on Monday, for example. The Times had a big story about Kemi Badenoch, in which she was highly critical, written to Director General of the BBC. The headline was, Badenoch, BBC Arabic platforms hate and terror. And in a letter to the DG, she threatened her party's withdrawal of support for the licence fee if there is not wholesale reform. She based her remarks on a report from what the Times called the media watchdog, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, otherwise known as CAMERA. Now, the Times didn't say at any point that CAMERA is a pro-Israeli organisation. It is set up in, I think, in the United States about 45 years ago. It has branches around the world, and it openly wants to challenge what it sees as misreporting of Israel. No reason why that report shouldn't be listened to, but every reason to point out where it comes from. And also I noticed that the journalist who broke the story on the BBC Gaza film, and to give him good credit, I mean, he identified weaknesses, David Collier, is openly an undercover researcher into anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and has claimed that the BBC put out Hamas propaganda pantomime. He was given an award by CAMERA, the organisation before. Now, not saying these people shouldn't be listened to, not saying what they say isn't accurate, but what is quite disturbing, I think, is that they are just presented to the public as if they were an independent media monitoring unit, and they're not. Now, that makes it quite difficult, doesn't it, to have a more balanced debate when you don't know, aren't aware of the background to these organisations.
Yes, and this has happened a lot. There was a report written, I can't remember when it was, by an Israeli-based lawyer who was called Asserman on exactly this subject.
Yes, we interviewed him on this podcast some months ago, yes.
It was totally, unashamedly, kind of a propaganda, really, on Israel's behalf. And then there was another report that was written by the Center for Media Monitoring, which analysed the Asserman report. It was quite clear that the fairness and objectivity was missing from the Asserman report. I put it as weakly and kindly as I can. And I think at the heart of it, there's a deeper issue that we need at some point as a society to think about. I have a lot of sympathy for pro-Israelis who suddenly find today that what sort of was the norm, which was that side, if you like, of the story received huge coverage and huge sympathy has somewhat shifted in these last couple of years. And I think there's a sort of element of shock about that because this didn't happen before. The Israeli side was constantly being told in the way they wanted it told. This shift, I do understand why it must feel like what's happened, has the whole world turned against us? And I understand that feeling. But Palestinians, for the longest time, one of the most beautiful books ever written about Palestine was by a very establishment BBC figure, Jonathan Dimbleby. I don't know if you've ever seen
Yes.
it. It's called Palestine. Yeah. It's the most radical book, actually, which has amazing photographs of how when the first Jewish people came to Palestine, they were received by the inhabitants, pictures of them being sitting, talking, eating together, but also a very political book. And I remember quoting that book in an article many years ago and receiving some really, really, really horrified responses, as if, there was some code that had been broken and they didn't know about Jonathan's book. And I think so the current way it's all going, I do understand why.
Well, I think the problem is, obviously, as people would say in Israel, I'm sure, hold on, look what's happened. We are now surrounded. We have got a whole range of regimes who wish the destruction of Israel. Look at what happened in that atrocity, that appalling atrocity that started off the present conflict. It wouldn't be surprising, would it, with people who have the memory of Europe trying to wipe out their race, and grandparents and others who were in Auschwitz and elsewhere always want and find the idea that there is one place in the world which will accept them unconditionally and they are safe, and that's Israel. And an Israel which they think is threatened not least from Iran and Hezbollah and virtually everybody else. I mean, one really has to try and understand that sort of mentality they would have, at the same time as pointing out, as you have, that the Israel of today is vastly different from the Israel that was set up in 1948 and the Israel that existed even 30 years ago.
I think Israel must exist, but I'm sorry, I no longer can accept this narrative. Israel is a nuclear power, and nobody knows how much nuclear arsenal they have because it's the only power that has never been inspected. It does not allow for inspections. And there was a very good BBC journalist at one point, I can't remember her name, who did a program on this and really had to leave the BBC because the consequence, and this was a long time ago.
Yeah, but I should say, I don't know, 40 odd years ago, I did a panorama program and I was editor about the cooperation between Israel and South Africa, whereby Israel can produce a bomb but can't test it. Their apartheid South Africa didn't have a bomb, but actually had a large amount of the Atlantic where it could test it and did so. No, I accept all of that. By the way, just one thing just to make sure. When you quoted the Centre for Media Monitoring, we should make clear that it aims to promote fair and responsible reporting of Muslims and Islam, just in the issue of fairness. I mean, going back to the way in which the BBC has to deal with all of these pressures, there is a tendency, I feel anyway, in the BBC, not just on this issue but previously, is when there's a big division of opinion, its desire for survival reduces to this on the one hand, on the other hand, and thinks that as long as it represents the differing viewpoints that are held, then it's discharged its duty. And, I would argue, others obviously would argue as well, that its duty is to actually find out the truth.
Yeah.
Do you think the BBC is now in such a squeeze that it's operating a sense of false balance?
Yes.
In some of these issues?
In fact, there is no balance. The balance is used as a way of not doing its journalism properly. And I love the BBC, but I was reading Samir Shah's interview in the Sunday Times magazine. And I know Samir. I've known Samir 30 years. And we like each other, but our politics are not the same. But I was astonished that for him, he's a program maker, so he knows what this is all about. And as my previous boss at The Independent, Simon Kellner, wrote yesterday in the I newspaper, he too was shocked by the interview and his focus on what needs to happen. What needs to happen is for the BBC to regain trust the trust of all its viewers. Dozens of journalists, young journalists, including of Arab origin, but not just, have left in the last 18 months because of the way Palestine is covered, because of the way the word genocide, as one of them said to a newspaper, is virtually banned. And genocide is a word that is now officially used since the South African case was put forward. The way they are told, you can't do a story on, starving Gaza children unless you do the similar story for Israelis, which isn't possible. So I think, but it's not just about Israel-Palestine. I think we need the BBC to become what it says it is, the most trusted outlet. It is no longer that trusted outlet. I think Palestine has tested not just the BBC, but our entire democracy. What is free speech? Who gets to speak? Who gets arrested? Who gets silenced? And we should all care about that because, okay, the Palestinian cause is a particular cause, but once the state oversteps the mark, we all know what can happen. And the BBC is part of a liberal tradition. People hate the word liberal, but Reith wanted a liberal bulwark to Nazism. That was the whole reason for creating the BBC. So there is a lot of work to be done, but for pro-Palestinian people, and I'm not just talking about Muslims, the disenchantment is deep.
I think the problem I was struck by reading my poet W.B. Yeats, and he wrote in 1916, which of course was a poem mainly about the Irish uprising. He said, "Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart." I've been quite shocked by perhaps one shouldn't be, by the hatred by both sides on this, but hearing people. I mean, I remember talking to the former chief rabbi. I thought, a wonderful man. And I asked him, when I was presenting the Sunday program for Radio 4, and I asked him, is a Jewish life worth more than any other life? And he said, of course not. I don't know what the answer you get now. And you yourself have said, and I just want to quote here, "Our values are worthless unless all victims matter equally. To treat some victims as more worthy of condemnation than others is unforgivable, and a betrayal of anti-racism itself."
I really believe that. Let me tell you a very quick story because it's important. When I came here from Uganda in 1972, I went to Oxford because I had a scholarship to do my postgraduate degree. So I came before the expulsion of Ugandan nations. But I was stuck in Oxford. I arrived in May. The expulsions happened in the autumn. The money dried up, and I thought I'd have to give up my education. I got a call from a wonderful world-famous Jewish scientist whose name was Professor Hugh Blaschko. His wife was a Quaker, Mary. And he said to me, he came from Berlin, his entire family was wiped out except for a sister. And he said to me, "I've been where you are now. I've lost my homeland. My wife and I will make a flat in our house and you can come and stay with us." My ex-husband was also there as a student, rent-free. We lived with them for 7 years, and they became our kind of in situ parents. And Hugh Blaschko always said to me, "Be glad you don't have a homeland." And these were his words, and they're in my memoir. Israel one day will bring out the worst in us. And I remembered him so much in the last 2 years. And I would argue with him because I really did believe in Israel. I remember thinking they made the desert bloom, and we'd have these odd arguments. But it's really important. I think for a lot of my Jewish friends, one of the worries is that this is not what it was meant to be.
At the heart of a lot of this is whether or not to be critical of the state of Israel is to be anti-Semitic. What's your view about that?
It is not to be anti-Semitic. Israel is a state. And like all other states, people have the right to criticize it. And the worst thing that has happened in the last 5 years is this definition was floated and accepted by some institutions under the conservatives, that to criticize Israel's policies, state policies, was a kind of veiled anti-Semitism. And it is so wrong and it is so dishonest to do that. Okay? There's no reason why Israel should be judged any more harshly than other states. And you've said how many other states in the Middle East I judge harshly. But to trap us into this is really wrong. And I just want to tell you, a member of the Knesset 3 months ago, his name was Kafis, asked to see me, and I get quite worried because, I'm sure Israel doesn't care for what I write. But in the end, I met him. He came to London. He was the most astonishing man. We had a meeting, and he said to me, Israel was a democracy once. There was such a thing. We could say it is the most open democracy in the Middle East. He said it no longer is. And the way they have kind of brought together criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism is the way they've stopped all criticism. And he said they've thrown him out of the Knesset, although I've been absolutely fairly elected because I side with Palestinians. He was Jewish. If we can't criticize this, it's for its own sake. For its own sake, never mind anything else. Israel did have a reputation once, which quite rightly, it had proven a democracy can exist in the Middle East. I'm sorry, that's gone.
Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, thank you very much. Our thanks to Yasmin Alibhai-Brown. And if you'd like to listen to my interview with Trevor Assison, which gives a rather different perspective, you can reach it via our website. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, please do support us. It will cost you less than a cup of coffee a month. You can do this by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. By signing up to Patreon, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. The link to this and our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. And as you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.